Travis Alexander bled out on his bathroom floor while the woman who claimed to love him washed blood from her hands and prepared to drive away as if nothing had happened. The violence was not quick, it was not merciful, and it was not the act of someone who had lost control. It was the final expression of someone who believed she owned him. Before we go further into this psychological unraveling, I want you to comment below. What is the most dangerous emotion in a relationship: jealousy, obsession, or the fear of being replaced? Your answer might reveal more about human nature than you think. The story of Jody and Arias is not simply a true crime case. It is a study in psychological deterioration, identity collapse, and the terrifying reality of what happens when attachment becomes pathological. This is not a tale of sudden violence or impulsive rage. This is the story of a woman who systematically dismantled her own identity to merge with another person. And when that merger was rejected, she destroyed what she could not possess. Understanding this case requires understanding the psychology of obsession itself, not as a romantic notion, but as a clinical reality that distorts perception, erodes boundaries, and ultimately justifies the unthinkable. September 2006, a business conference in Las Vegas. Jody Arias was 26 years old, working as a photographer and sales representative. Travis Alexander was 29, a motivational speaker and salesman deeply embedded in the culture of self-improvement and Mormon faith. Their meeting appeared unremarkable at first, two ambitious young people connecting over shared interests. But from the very beginning, there were psychological markers that would later prove critical. Within days of meeting Travis, Jody began altering fundamental aspects of her identity. She expressed interest in his religion. She adopted his social circles. She mirrored his values and interests with an intensity that went beyond normal relationship development. This was not gradual compatibility. This was identity enmeshment, a psychological pattern where one person begins to abandon their own sense of self in order to fuse with another. From a clinical perspective, this behavior reflects anxious attachment taken to an extreme. Individuals with unstable self-concepts often seek external validation through relationships. They do not simply want connection. They need it to feel whole. Without it, they experience not just loneliness, but existential emptiness. Jody converted to Mormonism shortly after meeting Travis. She was baptized into his faith within weeks. To outside observers, this might have appeared as genuine spiritual awakening. But psychologically, it represented something more concerning: the erasure of personal boundaries in service of maintaining proximity to another person. Ask yourself this: have you ever changed something fundamental about yourself to keep someone interested? Where is the line between compromise and self-abandonment? Travis and Jody began dating officially in early 2007. Friends later described the relationship as intense, volatile, and emotionally exhausting. They fought frequently. They broke up and reconciled repeatedly. Travis confided to friends that Jody was unpredictable, emotionally demanding, and difficult to satisfy. Yet he continued the relationship, drawn by physical attraction and perhaps by the intoxicating nature of being so completely desired. This dynamic, intense attraction paired with emotional instability is a hallmark of relationships that become psychologically dangerous. The highs are euphoric. The lows are devastating. And over time, the participants become addicted not to each other, but to the emotional intensity itself. By mid-2007, Travis ended the romantic relationship. He told Jody they were incompatible. He wanted to date other women. He needed space. For most people, this would be painful but ultimately survivable. For Jody, it was catastrophic. Psychologically, rejection activates different neural pathways depending on one's attachment style and self-concept. For securely attached individuals, rejection is processed as disappointment, painful, but not identity-threatening. For individuals with anxious or disorganized attachment, rejection is experienced as abandonment, which triggers panic, rage, and desperate attempts to re-establish connection. Jody did not accept the breakup. Instead, she intensified her efforts to remain relevant in Travis's life. She continued calling him. She sent emails oscillating between affection and hostility. She offered sexual availability even after the romantic relationship had officially ended. And critically, she began monitoring his communications without his knowledge. This surveillance behavior is psychologically significant. It represents an attempt to maintain control when emotional intimacy has been withdrawn. By accessing Travis's email accounts, reading his text messages, and tracking his interactions with other women, Jody was creating an illusion of continued connection. She was still part of his life, even if he did not know it. Would you have noticed these warning signs if you were Travis's friend? Or would you have dismissed them as the normal pain of a difficult breakup? In late 2007, Jody moved from Arizona to California, hundreds of miles away from Travis. On the surface, this appeared to be a healthy step toward moving on. But distance did not reduce her psychological fixation. If anything, it intensified it. She continued contacting Travis regularly. She drove back to Arizona multiple times to see him. She maintained sexual contact with him even while he dated other women. And she became increasingly distressed by evidence that he was forming new romantic connections. Friends later testified that Jody reacted with visible anger when Travis mentioned other women. She questioned him obsessively about his dating life. She accused him of betrayal, despite the fact that they were no longer in a relationship. This possessiveness, the belief that she still had claim to him, was not love. It was ownership. From a psychological standpoint, this is where obsession crosses into dangerous territory. Healthy attachment allows for separation. Obsessive attachment cannot tolerate it. The obsessed individual experiences the other person's autonomy as a personal attack, their independence as abandonment, their new relationships as betrayal. Throughout 2007 and early 2008, Jody's behavior escalated in ways that Travis's friends found increasingly alarming. She appeared uninvited at his home. She contacted his friends to gather information about his activities. She sent him messages that alternated between declarations of love and accusations of mistreatment. Travis confided to friends that he felt Jody was stalking him. He described feeling watched, monitored, and unable to move on with his life. Yet he continued to maintain contact with her, including sexual contact. This decision to maintain physical intimacy while attempting to establish emotional boundaries created a psychological dynamic that was ultimately unsustainable. From Jody's perspective, the continued sexual contact likely reinforced her belief that the relationship was not truly over. Each encounter became evidence that Travis still wanted her, still needed her, still belonged to her. The fact that he was simultaneously dating other women did not contradict this belief. It simply meant he was confused, misguided, or being influenced by others. This cognitive distortion, the inability to accept reality that contradicts one's desired narrative, is a critical feature of obsessive thinking. The obsessed individual does not process information objectively. They filter everything through the lens of their fixation, interpreting ambiguous signals as confirmation and dismissing clear rejections as temporary obstacles. Think about this. Have you ever convinced yourself that someone's mixed signals meant they really cared, even when their words said otherwise? That cognitive distortion, taken to an extreme, becomes dangerous. By early 2008, Travis had made clear plans to move forward with his life. He was planning a trip to Cancun with a woman he was dating. He was discussing marriage possibilities with friends. He was actively creating a future that did not include Jody. For Jody, this represented an existential threat. It was not simply that Travis was dating someone else, it was that he was building a life in which she was irrelevant. For someone whose identity had become entirely enmeshed with another person, irrelevance is not just painful. It is annihilating. Witnesses later testified that Jody became increasingly agitated in the weeks leading up to June 2008. She made comments about Travis that suggested both longing and resentment. She spoke of feeling betrayed, used, and discarded. And she began making preparations that, in retrospect, appear chillingly deliberate. June 4, 2008, Travis Alexander was alone in his Mesa, Arizona home. Jody Arias drove from California to Arizona, a journey of hundreds of miles. She later claimed this trip was spontaneous, unplanned, a last-minute decision. The evidence suggested otherwise. She had rented a car, specifically requesting a model that would not stand out. She had borrowed gas cans to avoid leaving a credit card trail at gas stations. She had turned off her cell phone to avoid creating location data. These were not the actions of someone acting impulsively. These were the actions of someone who understood consequences and was attempting to avoid them. When Jody arrived at Travis's home, she was welcomed inside. They spent time together. They were intimate. A camera found later in the home contained photographs documenting this intimacy, images of Travis in the shower, relaxed and unaware of what was about to happen. Then the violence began. Travis Alexander was stabbed 27 times. He was shot in the head. His throat was slashed so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. The attack was prolonged, brutal, and personal. He fought for his life, evidenced by defensive wounds on his hands. He tried to escape, leaving a trail of blood through the bathroom and hallway. And ultimately, he died in his own bathroom, alone with the woman who claimed to love him. The level of violence in this case is psychologically significant. Forensic psychologists use the term overkill to describe attacks that go far beyond what is necessary to cause death. Overkill indicates intense personal emotion rage, betrayal, loss of control. It suggests that the violence was not instrumental, not goal-oriented, but expressive. It was a physical manifestation of psychological anguish. But here's what makes this case particularly disturbing. The violence was followed by deliberate cleanup. Jody washed blood from her body. She attempted to clean the crime scene. She placed the camera in a washing machine, likely hoping to destroy evidence. These actions demonstrate post-crime cognitive functioning. They demonstrate awareness, planning, and an understanding of consequences. This combination extreme violence followed by calculated cleanup creates a psychological paradox. It suggests someone who is simultaneously out of control and in control. Someone who could commit brutal violence and then immediately shift into problem-solving mode. Ask yourself, can someone truly lose control and then immediately regain it to cover their tracks? Or does that pattern reveal something more calculated? After killing Travis Alexander, Jody Arias did not behave like someone in shock or trauma. She did not call police. She did not seek help. Instead, she drove away from the scene, disposed of evidence along the route, and returned to her life in California as if nothing had happened. In the days following the murder, she attended social events. She went to work. She interacted with friends normally. When Travis's body was discovered by concerned friends 5 days later, Jody expressed shock and grief. She sent flowers to his memorial service. She spoke of him in the present tense, as if he were still alive. This ability to maintain normalcy after committing extreme violence is psychologically revealing. It suggests compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of experience so completely that they do not interact. It also suggests a profound disconnect between action and emotional consequence, a feature often associated with narcissistic and antisocial personality traits. When police contacted Jody for questioning, she initially denied being in Arizona at the time of the murder. She provided an alibi. She expressed confusion about why she would be considered a suspect. This first narrative-complete denial lasted until evidence contradicted it. Then her story changed. In her second narrative, Jody claimed that masked intruders had broken into Travis's home while she was there. She described being held at gunpoint, watching helplessly as Travis was killed and fleeing in terror. The story was elaborate, detailed, and completely fabricated. When this narrative also collapsed under scrutiny, she changed her story again. In her third and final narrative, Jody claimed self-defense. She stated that Travis had become violent, that she feared for her life, that the killing was a desperate act of survival. This version became her official defense at trial. These shifting narratives are psychologically significant. They are not simply lies told to avoid consequences. They represent a pattern of pathological lying, the construction of alternative realities designed to preserve a particular self-image. Each story positioned Jody as a victim, never as an aggressor. Each story externalized responsibility, placing blame on circumstances, intruders, or Travis himself. This inability to accept accountability is a hallmark of certain personality disorders, particularly those with narcissistic features. For individuals with fragile self-concepts, admitting wrongdoing threatens the entire psychological structure. It is not just that they do not want to accept responsibility, it is that they psychologically cannot without experiencing complete identity collapse. Would you be able to tell if someone was lying to you with this level of conviction? Or would their certainty make you doubt your own perception? Jody Arias' trial began in January 2013 and quickly became a media spectacle. But beyond the public fascination, the trial revealed profound insights into the psychology of someone who had committed extreme violence and then constructed elaborate justifications for it. Her courtroom demeanor became a subject of intense scrutiny. She smiled at inappropriate moments. She appeared emotionally detached during graphic testimony. She spoke in controlled, measured language that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Psychologists noted her apparent ability to modulate emotion depending on the audience, crying when it seemed strategic, appearing calm when it served her narrative. This performative quality is psychologically revealing. It suggests that emotional expression was not authentic, but instrumental used as a tool to achieve specific outcomes rather than as a genuine reflection of internal experience. During her testimony, Jody spent 18 days on the stand, an unusually long time. She provided extensive detail about her relationship with Travis, describing him as emotionally abusive, sexually deviant, and physically threatening. She painted herself as a victim of manipulation and violence, someone who had endured mistreatment and finally defended herself in a moment of terror. But the evidence contradicted this narrative at nearly every point. Text messages showed Jody initiating contact far more often than Travis. Witnesses testified that Travis had expressed fear of Jody, not the other way around. The forensic evidence indicated an attack that was prolonged and brutal, not a brief defensive struggle. Perhaps most damaging was the psychological testimony. Experts who evaluated Jody described traits consistent with borderline and narcissistic personality patterns: fear of abandonment, unstable identity, emotional extremes, and grandiose self-presentation paired with deep insecurity. They noted her tendency to externalize blame, her inability to accept responsibility, and her construction of alternative narratives that preserved her self-image as a victim. One expert testified that Jody exhibited traits of someone who experienced others not as separate individuals with their own autonomy, but as extensions of herself, objects that existed to fulfill her needs. When Travis asserted his independence, when he chose other women, when he built a life that did not include her, he was not simply rejecting her. He was violating the fundamental order of her psychological universe. Think about this. Have you ever felt that someone owed you their attention, their time, their love? That sense of entitlement, magnified and distorted, becomes dangerous. The prosecution argued that this was not self-defense but premeditated murder driven by jealousy, rage, and an inability to accept rejection. They presented evidence of planning: the rented car, the gas cans, the turned-off cell phone. They demonstrated that Jody had traveled hundreds of miles to confront Travis at a time when he was vulnerable and alone. The defense maintained that Jody had been a victim of abuse, that her actions were a response to years of mistreatment, that she had killed Travis only because she believed he was about to kill her. The jury deliberated for 15 hours. On May 8, 2013, they returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. They rejected the self-defense claim. They found that the killing was premeditated, deliberate, and cruel. The penalty phase of the trial proved even more contentious than the guilt phase. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the murder was especially cruel and that Jody had shown no genuine remorse. The defense argued for life in prison, presenting mitigating factors including Jody's age, her lack of prior criminal history, and her potential for rehabilitation. The jury deadlocked on the sentence, unable to reach unanimous agreement on death versus life imprisonment. A second penalty phase jury also deadlocked. Finally, in April 2015, the judge sentenced Jody Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never be released. She will spend the remainder of her life in custody, removed from society, unable to harm anyone else. But the psychological questions raised by this case remain unresolved. What drives someone to kill the person they claim to love? This question has no simple answer, but psychological research offers important insights. First, we must understand that obsessive love is not love at all. It is a form of psychological possession, where another person is experienced not as a separate individual, but as an extension of oneself. When that person asserts independence, it is experienced not as their right but as a betrayal, an abandonment, an existential threat. Second, we must recognize that identity enmeshment creates profound psychological vulnerability. When someone has abandoned their own sense of self to merge with another person, the loss of that person threatens their entire psychological structure. They do not simply lose a relationship, they lose themselves. Third, we must acknowledge that certain personality patterns make violence more likely when rejection occurs. Individuals with narcissistic traits may experience rejection as a narcissistic injury, a wound to their grandiose self-image that triggers rage. Individuals with borderline traits may experience rejection as abandonment, a confirmation of their deepest fear that they are unlovable and will be left alone. Fourth, we must understand that cognitive distortions allow individuals to justify violence to themselves. Jody did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a victim who had been pushed too far, who had endured too much, who had finally defended herself. This self-narrative, however distorted, allowed her to commit extreme violence without experiencing it as morally wrong. And finally, we must recognize that the capacity for violence exists in more people than we would like to believe. Most people with obsessive attachment patterns do not become violent. Most people with personality disorders do not kill. But under the right circumstances, intense rejection, perceived betrayal, loss of control, some individuals cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. The question is not whether Jody Arias is a monster. The question is, what psychological factors transformed a young woman into someone capable of such extreme violence? Travis Alexander was 30 years old when he died. He was a son, a brother, a friend. He had dreams, ambitions, and a future that was stolen from him. His family has spoken publicly about their loss, describing the ongoing trauma of losing someone they loved in such a brutal way. But there are other victims in this case as well. Travis's friends who discovered his body and will carry that image for the rest of their lives. The jurors who had to view graphic crime scene photographs and listen to weeks of disturbing testimony. The broader community which was forced to confront the reality that someone they knew was capable of such violence. And in a different sense, Jody Arias herself is a victim not of Travis, but of her own psychological dysfunction. She destroyed her own life along with his. She will spend decades in prison, removed from society, defined forever by the worst thing she ever did. This is not to excuse her actions or minimize her responsibility. It is simply to acknowledge that this case represents a complete psychological collapse, a failure of emotional regulation, identity formation, and moral reasoning that resulted in tragedy for everyone involved. If there is any value to be extracted from this horrific case, it is in understanding the warning signs of dangerous obsession. These signs do not guarantee violence, but they indicate psychological patterns that require intervention, rapid identity changes to match a partner's interests and values. This suggests unstable self-concept and excessive dependence on external validation, inability to accept the end of a relationship. Healthy individuals grieve and move forward. Obsessed individuals escalate contact, refuse boundaries, and become increasingly desperate. Surveillance and monitoring behavior. Accessing someone's accounts, tracking their location, and gathering information about their activities indicates a need for control that goes beyond normal relationship dynamics, extreme emotional volatility. Relationships characterized by intense highs and devastating lows create addiction to emotional intensity rather than genuine connection. Externalization of blame. Individuals who cannot accept responsibility for their own emotions and actions are more likely to justify extreme behavior as someone else's fault. Possessiveness and jealousy that goes beyond normal concern. The belief that one has ownership over another person is fundamentally dangerous. Threats or statements about not being able to live without the other person. These should always be taken seriously, as they indicate psychological dependence that could become dangerous. If you recognize these patterns in your own relationships or in the relationships of people you care about, intervention is critical. Obsessive attachment is not romantic, it is pathological, and in rare but devastating cases, it becomes lethal. Perhaps the most psychologically fascinating aspect of this case is the concept of the manufactured self. Jody Arias did not have a stable, coherent identity. Instead, she constructed different versions of herself depending on what she believed others wanted from her. With Travis, she became Mormon, adopted his values, mirrored his interests. With investigators, she became the innocent victim, the confused witness, the traumatized survivor. In court, she became the abused woman, the defender of her own life, the misunderstood defendant. None of these versions were authentic. They were performances, carefully constructed to achieve specific outcomes. And when these performances failed to produce the desired results, she simply constructed new ones. This psychological pattern, the inability to maintain a consistent sense of self, is profoundly destabilizing. Without a core identity, individuals become reactive rather than proactive, responding to external demands rather than internal values. They experience others as mirrors that reflect back who they should be, rather than as separate individuals with their own needs and autonomy. When Travis rejected Jody, he was not simply ending a relationship. He was destroying the version of herself that she had constructed around him. And because she had no stable identity to fall back on, that destruction felt total. The violence that followed was not just about losing Travis. It was about losing herself. At its core, this case is about a fundamental psychological conflict, the tension between our desire for connection and our need for autonomy. Healthy relationships balance these needs. Obsessive relationships collapse them. Jody Arias believed she had a right to Travis Alexander. She believed that her feelings, her needs, her desires gave her claim to his life, his choices, his future. When he asserted his autonomy, when he chose other women, when he built a life without her, she experienced it not as his right but as her injury. This belief that intense feeling creates ownership is the most dangerous psychological element of this entire case. It is the belief that allowed her to justify surveillance, stalking, and ultimately violence. It is the belief that transformed love into possession and rejection into betrayal. Travis Alexander did not belong to Jody Arias. He belonged to himself. His autonomy was not negotiable. His right to choose his own path was absolute. And when she killed him, she did not just take his life. She took his fundamental human right to exist independently of her needs. That is the true horror of this case. Not the violence itself, but the psychological framework that made the violence seem justified. Jody Arias is currently incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville. She will remain there for the rest of her life. She has given interviews from prison, maintaining various versions of her narrative. She has sold artwork. She has maintained a social media presence through intermediaries. Some people remain fascinated by her. Others are repulsed. But the psychological reality is that she is now defined entirely by the worst thing she ever did. Whatever potential she had, whatever future she might have built, is gone. She destroyed it along with Travis. Travis Alexander's family continues to grieve. They have spoken about the ongoing trauma of losing him, the difficulty of moving forward, the pain of seeing his killer maintain a public presence. For them, there is no closure, no resolution, only the permanent absence of someone they loved. And the broader question remains, how do we identify dangerous obsession before it becomes violent? How do we intervene in relationships that are psychologically toxic before they become lethal? How do we teach people that intense feeling does not create ownership? That rejection is not betrayal, that other people's autonomy is not a personal attack. These questions have no easy answers. But they are questions we must continue asking. The case of Jody Arias is not a love story gone wrong. It is a psychological study in obsession, identity collapse, and the terrifying reality of what happens when attachment becomes pathological. It is a reminder that the most dangerous person in your life is often not a stranger, but someone who claims to love you. It is a warning that intense emotion is not the same as healthy connection, that passion can mask pathology, that devotion can disguise possession. It is a demonstration that violence is not always impulsive, that murder can be both emotional and calculated, that someone can kill brutally and then clean up methodically. And it is a testament to the fact that some people experience others, not as separate individuals with their own rights and autonomy, but as objects that exist to fulfill their needs. When those objects assert independence, when they choose their own path, when they refuse to be possessed, some individuals respond with violence. Travis Alexander was killed because he dared to live his own life. He was killed because he chose other women. He was killed because he built a future that did not include his killer. He was killed because someone believed they owned him. And when he proved they did not, they destroyed what they could not possess. That belief ownership over another human being is the most dangerous psychological element of all. It is the belief that transforms love into obsession, rejection into rage, and ultimately, attachment into violence. Jody Arias will spend the rest of her life in prison. Travis Alexander will remain forever 30 years old, his potential unfulfilled, his future stolen. And the rest of us are left with the uncomfortable question. How many relationships around us right now contain the seeds of the same psychological pattern? How many people are experiencing obsession as love, possession as devotion, control as care? The answer is more than we would like to believe. And that is the most disturbing truth of all.